The burlap sack felt heavier than 7-year-old Violet Pike remembered its coarse fabric scratching against her small arms as she pressed it to her chest like a shield against the world's cruelty. 3 nights ago, her father Henry had packed it with trembling hands, while her mother Ruth heated milk on the stove, their voices hushed but urgent. "If something happens to us, little bird," Papa had whispered using her pet name, "you keep this safe. Promise me." She had promised, not understanding why his calloused fingers shook as he tied the drawstring, why Mama kept glancing toward the window with terror in her brown eyes. Now crouched behind the fallen log in the pine clearing where their wagon still smoldered, Violet understood everything with the terrible clarity that comes with witnessing unspeakable violence. The acrid smoke stung her nostrils, mixing ash with a metallic tang of blood that stained the earth where Papa had fallen. His final words echoed in her mind, not to her, but shouted at the men in canvas coats. "She's just a child, leave her be." The crack of rifles had silenced him forever. But somehow, in the chaos and screaming, Violet had grabbed the sack and run into the wilderness that had become her only sanctuary. Her blue cotton dress hung in tatters torn by thorns during her desperate flight through the underbrush. Dirt streaked her pale cheeks, and her chestnut hair tangled around her face like a wild creature's mane. She had been hiding since dawn, surviving on terror, and the fading hope that someone, anyone, might come to help her in this vast, merciless landscape. Footsteps approached through the forest, measured and careful. Through gaps in the rotting log, she watched a figure emerge from the tree line with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh country. The man was Apache, his weathered face marked by decades under the unforgiving sun. Dasan moved with a pronounced limp, his left leg stiff from an old bullet wound that had never healed properly. At 47, silver streaked his black hair, which was pulled back with strips of rawhide. His buckskin shirt bore the stains of hard travel, and a bone-handled knife hung at his side. As he walked, Dasan paused occasionally to break a pine branch in a specific way, leaving it bent but not severed, a signal his people would recognize. He arranged 3 stones in a small cairn beside a distinctive boulder, then scattered them to look natural while keeping their relative positions meaningful. These were not random acts, but deliberate markers, a trail that would guide others of his people to follow if they came searching. He paused at the wagon's skeletal remains, dark eyes cataloging the scattered belongings with the practiced gaze of a warrior who had seen too much death. Something had drawn him here, across miles of treacherous terrain, a debt that gnawed at his conscience like an infected wound. 2 winters ago, Henry Pike had shared his fire and warned him of approaching cavalry, an act of unexpected kindness from a white man that had saved Dasan's life. Among the Mescalero, such debts were sacred binding beyond death itself. As Dasan knelt beside the wagon's twisted frame, his sharp gaze found the child's hiding place. But he made no sudden movements, understanding the terror of cornered prey. Instead, he began to gather scattered items from the wreckage: a dented water canteen, strips of jerky wrapped in cloth, a thick wool blanket. These he placed carefully in the very sack that Violet now clutched, recognizing provisions packed by a father who knew death was stalking his family. "Child." His voice carried the gentleness reserved for wounded animals, his English clear despite its accent. "I bring what belongs to you." Violet's grip tightened until her knuckles went white. She could still hear Papa's frantic whispers as he prepared those supplies, still see Mama's tears falling like rain. "Take this if we cannot," he had said. "Find help. Tell them what happened here." Dasan approached slowly, each step careful on the uneven ground. His limp was more pronounced, now aggravated by days of tracking through mountain passes. Behind him, he had left more subtle signs, a stick broken and thrust into the ground. At an angle, small piles of pine needles arranged in patterns that meant nothing to white eyes, but everything to Apache scouts. "Your father, Henry Pike, good man," Dasan said quietly. Shared coffee when soldiers hunted me like animal. Warned me of danger when he could have stayed silent. I owe him life. The girl's voice emerged as barely a whisper, thick with grief that no child should carry. They took Mama. The company men said Papa was stealing, but he never stole nothing. Never. I know. Dasan settled onto his haunches with a grimace of pain. Henry Pike worked honest. Company lies to justify murder. During their brief encounter 2 years before, fear and gratitude had forged an unlikely bond between warrior and homesteader. Henry had spoken of his wife's gentle nature, his daughter's stubborn spirit, his dreams of a better life away from the corruption that poisoned everything Crowder's company touched. Now those dreams lay scattered like ashes in the wind. The thunder of hoofbeats shattered the afternoon quiet. 2 riders burst from the southern trail, their mounts foam-flecked from hard pursuit. Canvas dusters marked them as Black Mesa employees, and the lead rider, a scarred man with pale, predatory eyes, raised his Winchester the moment he spotted movement in the clearing. Now there they are. His shout split the air like an axe. Indian and the Pike brat. The rifle's crack sent bark exploding from the pine above Violet's head. She screamed a sound torn from her soul and pressed herself against the rotting wood. The precious sack crushed against her ribs as terror flooded her small body like ice water. "Please don't take it from me." She sobbed, her voice breaking with desperate need that came from some primal understanding that this sack contained more than provisions. It held her family's last hope for justice. Dasan looked down at the frightened child and saw Henry Pike's stubborn chin, Ruth Pike's kind eyes, and something deeper in innocence that cruel men sought to destroy for profit. His weathered features shifted not with amusement, but with iron determination, forged in decades of warfare against impossible odds. A smile touched his lips, grim as winter stone. "It is yours?" he said simply. "I brought it to you. Now we keep it safe together." Moving with startling speed despite his injury, Dasan scooped Violet behind the log as another shot splintered wood inches from their heads. He grabbed a handful of loose stones and hurled them into brush 20 yards to their left, the clatter suggesting fleeing quarry to ears not trained in Apache deception. As he did so, he swiftly arranged 3 small stones at the base of their hiding spot, another marker for those who might follow. "They're running toward the creek." The second rider spurred his horse toward the false trail dust, churning beneath pounding hooves. In that crucial moment of misdirection, Dasan lifted Violet onto his back, the sack secured between them like armor. He plunged into dense undergrowth, his wounded legs screaming protest with each jarring step. Behind him, Violet's terrified whimpers mixed with the crash of pursuit through brittle branches as their deception was quickly discovered. The chase erupted with deadly intent. Shouts echoed through the forest as the riders realized their mistake and wheeled around, cursing their own stupidity while spurring their mounts harder. Dasan reached a steep draw carved by spring floods, its sides treacherous with loose shale and jutting roots that could break bones or snap ankles. At a distinctive dead snag, he paused to strip bark in a specific pattern, another sign for his people, before beginning the treacherous descent. The shale cut deep blood, making his grip slippery and uncertain. Behind them, rifle shots cracked like thunder in the confined space. A bullet whined off stone so close to Dasan's head that rock fragments peppered his cheek, leaving tiny cuts that bled freely. He half slid, half fell down the treacherous slope, Violet clinging to his neck with desperate strength, while loose rocks cascaded around them like deadly rain. At the bottom, a creek ran swift and merciless, with mountain snowmelt. The water hit Dasan's legs like hammers forged from winter itself. But he waded in without pause, holding Violet high above the rushing current that could sweep them both to their deaths. Before entering the water, he had wedged a small stick between 2 rocks, pointing downstream, another marker for those who would need to know which way he had gone. Bullets splashed around them like deadly hail. One slug passed so close to Violet's head that she felt its wind, but Dasan pushed forward with relentless determination. His wounded leg buckled suddenly, and for one terrifying moment, they both went under. Violet's scream was cut short by icy water that burned her lungs like liquid fire. She surfaced, gasping and choking, still clinging to Dasan's shoulders as he regained his footing through sheer will. The current had carried them 50 yards downstream, but they were alive, and that was enough. A coyote, panicked by the gunfire, echoing through the canyon, crashed through brush on the far bank, buying them precious seconds as their pursuers tried to determine which noise to follow. Dasan reached the opposite shore and disappeared into a maze of pine and aspen where the trees grew thick enough to hide an army. As the sun painted the peaks in dying gold, Dasan found sanctuary, a narrow cave, hidden behind curtains of pine boughs, its entrance nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the chamber opened into a dry space, carved by patient water over countless centuries. Working with practiced efficiency despite his exhaustion, Dasan built a small fire deep in the cave, where smoke would dissipate through hidden fissures. He wrapped Violet in the wool blanket from her father's sack, his warrior's hands gentle as he cleaned a small cut on her cheek. "You are safe now," he murmured, though his eyes remained watchful. "Rest. Tomorrow we decide what comes next." But Violet wasn't ready for rest. Her small fingers worked at the sack's opening, revealing its carefully arranged contents. "Papa said I should take care of Mama," she whispered. "But those company men took her away in chains. They said she was stealing too, but Mama never took nothing that wasn't earned honest." Dasan nodded grimly. 5 years ago, he had lost his sister to Harrison Crowder's systematic cruelty, crushed under tons of rock in a mineshaft collapse, while imprisoned for trespassing on ancestral land. "Your mother?" Dasan asked carefully. "Where did they take her?" "I heard one say Lantern's End." Violet's voice grew smaller. "That's the mining town where Papa used to sell our eggs. Said it was ruled by the devil himself." Violet's fumbling hands found something hidden in the sack's bottom, a package wrapped in oiled cloth, protected from moisture and prying eyes. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing folded documents covered in her father's precise handwriting. "Papa made me promise to keep this safe," she said, her young face grave in the firelight. "He was real scared when he wrote it, kept checking the windows like death was coming for us all." Dasan took the papers and read by flickering flame. Henry Pike had documented a pattern of corruption reaching from individual mine shafts to the territorial government itself. Illegal payrolls, fraudulent land claims, bribed officials, and most damning detailed references to D14, an underground prison where Crowder held his enemies. But there was something else, something that made Dasan's eyes narrow. Among the documented crimes was a personal note written in Henry's careful hand. "Cannot believe what I discovered about the deputy. Ruth's brother Caleb vanished years ago after stealing from family during parents' illness. Now I find he works for Crowder under different name. How can I tell Ruth her brother became Deputy Stern, the same man who murdered 3 witnesses last month? She will be heartbroken. But she deserves to know the truth about 'that's the way of it,' his old saying that hasn't changed." The note was dated 2 weeks before Henry's death. Dasan folded the papers carefully, sensing the explosive nature of this revelation, without fully understanding its implications yet. Outside their sanctuary, night sounds gradually resumed while Dasan maintained his vigil. His wounded leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but he had sworn an oath to a dead man. In the shadows cast by firelight, he saw faces of the lost, his sister Henry Pike. Countless others who had stood against Harrison Crowder and paid the ultimate price. Dawn crept gray and cold through mountain passes. Dasan woke to find Violet already conscious, staring at the cave entrance, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "I keep thinking about Mama," she whispered. "What if they're hurting her right now while we're safe in here?" They set out as morning light began to pierce the forest canopy, following deer trails and hidden paths. Dasan's destination was clear, the homestead of Nora Whitcomb, a widow whose husband had died in one of Crowder's mines under suspicious circumstances. The journey tested them both. Twice they detoured around Fresh Bear Sign, while Dasan continued to leave trail markers, a branch broken at shoulder height, stones arranged in a small triangle there. When they reached a creek swollen with recent rains, he fashioned a rope from twisted pine roots and secured it around his waist before attempting the crossing. The current nearly swept him away his wounded leg, finding no purchase on slippery rocks. For terrifying moments, they both went under, before Dasan clawed his way to the far bank, both gasping and shivering, but alive. By midday, smoke rose from Nora Whitcomb's chimney. The homestead nestled in a small valley protected by pine-covered hills. It was modest, but well-maintained, a log cabin with stone chimney, a small barn fields gone largely to seed since her husband's death. Nora was hanging laundry when they emerged from the tree line. She was a woman in her 40s, brown hair streaked with premature gray, her face carved by hard work and grief. When she saw them approaching, she immediately reached for the rifle leaning against her porch rail. "That's far enough." Her voice carried authority earned through necessity. "State your business or move along." Dasan raised his hands, movement slow and unthreatening. "I am Dasan of the Mescalero. This is Violet Pike. We need help from someone who understands what Crowder's company does to innocent families." The name Pike caused a visible shift in Nora's expression. "Pike? You mean Henry Pike's little girl?" She lowered the rifle slightly. "Heard there was terrible trouble at their place. Some folks saying Henry got mixed up with claim jumpers. Henry Pike was good man who died fighting evil," Dasan said firmly. "Murdered by Crowder's men because he had proof of their crimes. Wife taken prisoner. Child has nowhere else to go." Nora studied them both for a long moment, taking in Violet's torn dress and haunted expression, Dasan's obvious injury. Finally, she set the rifle aside and stepped down from the porch. "Come inside then," she said. "But I warn you, if this is some kind of trick, you'll regret it." The cabin's interior was spare but spotless, furnished with handmade chairs and a well-used table. Nora set water to boil and brought out what food she could spare: cornbread, preserved apples, fresh milk from her cow. As they ate, Violet told her story in halting words, frequently looking to Dasan for strength. When she mentioned the men in canvas coats, Nora's face darkened. "Man, Crowder's hunters," she said, spitting the words like poison. "They've been ranging farther from town lately, pushing out anyone who might cause trouble." She paused, setting down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "I heard Deputy Stern talking in town last week. He's got this way of speaking real formal-like, but he always ends his conversations the same way. Says, that's the way of it. Like it settles every argument. Heard him tell Mrs. Morrison, whose husband died in a cave-in, that accidents happen in dangerous work, and that's the way of it. Cold as winter stone, that man." Violet looked up sharply. "Mama used to have a brother who said that all the time. She told me about him once, said it was an annoying habit he got from their daddy. But her brother ran away years ago when Grandma and Grandpa got sick." Nora's eyes widened slightly. "What was his name, child?" "Caleb," Violet said without hesitation. "Mama said his name was Caleb, and she always wondered what happened to him after he left Kansas." The implication hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. But neither Nora nor Dasan voiced their growing suspicions yet. There would be time for such revelations later. "What's your stake in helping us?" Dasan asked. "Most people learn to stay clear of company business." Nora's hand moved unconsciously to a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A young man with her eyes and a hopeful smile. "My boy Tommy died in a cave-in at number 3 Shaft 2 years back. Just 16 years old, strong as a bull. But even he couldn't lift 1,000,000 tons of rock when the supports gave way. Her voice caught with pain that time had dulled but never eliminated. Company said it was God's will gave me $20 compensation. Deputy Stern himself delivered the money, said accidents happen in dangerous work, and that's the way of it. Her face hardened. Same words, same cold tone, like he was reading from a script written by the devil himself. She rose from the table and moved to a wooden chest in the corner. From inside, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Tommy's effects, she explained. Company sent them back minus anything valuable. But there's something here you need to see. Inside the bundle lay a brass tag stamped with D14 and a series of numbers. Violet gasped when she saw it reaching into her father's sack to produce an identical tag. Papa had one just like it, she said. I didn't know what it meant, but he carved his initials on the back. She turned the tag over, revealing HP, scratched deep into the brass. Nora's face went pale. Dear God, where did your father get that? I don't know, Violet admitted. But he kept it in his special box with important papers. Dasan examined both tags carefully. What exactly is D14? Officially, it's supposed to be a storage tunnel. Nora said, her voice tight with fear. But everyone knows better. It's where Crowder keeps people who cause him trouble, workers who complain about conditions, settlers who won't sell their land, anyone with proof of his crimes. She looked directly at Violet. If your mother's still alive, that's where they'd take her. The sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. Nora moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 2 riders, she whispered. Company men. Dasan was already moving, gathering Violet and their possessions. But Nora caught his arm. The root cellar, she said, pointing to a trap door hidden beneath a braided rug. Take the girl and hide. I'll handle this. The space beneath the cabin was cramped and dark, thick with the smell of stored vegetables. Dasan and Violet crouched in the blackness, listening to muffled voices above. Afternoon, Mrs. Whitcomb. The man's voice was professionally polite, but carried an undertone of barely controlled violence. We're looking for a missing child, Violet Pike. Her family's had some trouble, and we're concerned for her safety. Don't know any Pikes, Nora replied with practiced calm. Mostly keep to myself these days. That's interesting, the man continued. Because we tracked her this far before losing the trail. An Apache was seen with her big fellow with a bad limp. You haven't seen anyone like that, have you? If I had you think I'd still be standing here talking peaceful-like. Nora's voice was steady as stone. Through gaps in the floorboards, Dasan could see boots moving across the floor as someone searched the small space. Mind if we look around, just to be thorough? I mind plenty. Nora said, her voice hardening. This is my home, and you've got no legal right to search it without proper cause. We've got all the cause we need. The second voice spoke rougher than his partner's. Company's lost valuable property, and that makes it our business to recover it. But they could hear the first man calling from outside. Jake, fresh horse tracks heading north toward the old mining road, not more than an hour old. The boots retreated, and soon they could hear the men searching the outbuildings. After what felt like hours, they heard the riders mount up and leave. Nora waited another long interval before opening the trap door. They're gone for now, she said, but they'll be back with more men. You can't stay here without bringing death to my door. Dasan climbed out of the cellar, his wounded leg cramping from the confined space. We need to reach Lantern's End. Find Ruth Pike before they decide she's too dangerous to keep alive. That's pure suicide, Nora said flatly. Crowder owns that town completely. You walk in there, you'll disappear just like Henry did. Then what do you suggest? Dasan asked. Nora was quiet for a moment, staring at the brass tags on her table. When she looked up, her expression held dangerous clarity. I suggest we make Harrison Crowder pay for what he's done, she said, her voice gaining strength. All of it. My Tommy, your sister, the Pikes, everyone who suffered because of his greed. She moved to the chest again and withdrew an old army Colt. I'm coming with you, and I know someone in town who might help us. This is not your fight, Dasan protested. The hell it isn't. Nora shot back with vehemence. I've been fighting this fight for 2 years, ever since they sent me my boy's effects in a paper bag. Tommy was trying to organize the miners, you know. Wanted safer working conditions, fair wages. The day before that cave-in, he told me the supports in his section looked rotten. Said he was going to talk to the foreman about it. Her voice broke slightly. The cave-in happened right where Tommy said it would. Right where he was working. That wasn't an accident, that was murder. As they prepared to leave, making what plans they could with limited resources, Violet clutched her father's sack tighter than ever. Inside, along with the provisions and damning evidence, lay her family's entire future, and possibly the key to Harrison Crowder's long-overdue downfall. The road to Lantern's End wound through increasingly desolate country, where the very land seemed poisoned by industrial greed. Mountains gave way to scrubland dotted with abandoned claims and rusting machinery. The air grew thick with dust and acrid smoke from ore processing plants, and streams ran orange with poisonous tailings. They approached the town from the east, following a route Nora knew would avoid the main checkpoints. As a miner's widow, she still had legitimate business in Lantern's End, but traveling with an Apache warrior and a fugitive child would raise questions they couldn't safely answer. Lantern's End sprawled like a diseased growth in the valley's bottom, a study in harsh contrasts. The main street boasted impressive buildings, company headquarters with iron-barred windows, a grand hotel, a bank. But the side streets were lined with ramshackle shanties where miners' families lived in conditions that would shame civilized society. Dasan and Violet waited in an abandoned prospector's cabin on the town's outskirts, while Nora scouted their situation. She returned after dark with disturbing news. Ruth Pike's being held in the company jail, she reported. Officially charged with conspiracy to defraud the company. Unofficially, everyone knows it's because she witnessed her husband's murder. Can we reach her? Dasan asked. Maybe, but it won't be simple. The jail sits right next to company headquarters with guards posted around the clock. Nora paused, choosing her words carefully. There's something else? I heard Deputy Stern talking to some of his men at the Silver Dollar Saloon. He was giving orders about transferring Ruth to D14 tomorrow night. But the way he said it. She shuddered. He called her Ruth, not Mrs. Pike, like you'd expect from a lawman. And when one of his men asked why the rush, Stern said something strange. Family business needs settling, and that's the way of it. Dasan felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Family business. The note in Henry's papers mentioned the deputy's real identity. What note? Nora asked. Dasan carefully withdrew Henry's documents from Violet's sack, finding the page that had troubled him. He read it aloud. Cannot believe what I discovered about the deputy. Ruth's brother Caleb vanished years ago after stealing from family during parents' illness. Now I find he works for Crowder under different name. How can I tell Ruth her brother became Deputy Stern? The implications hit them all at once. Ruth Pike wasn't just facing imprisonment and death at the hands of her husband's killers. She was facing betrayal by her own blood. We need help, Dasan said. Someone who knows the town's rhythms and can move freely where we cannot. I know just the man, Nora said reluctantly. Jules Martel runs high-stakes card games at the Copper Dollar Saloon. He's got no love for Crowder, though he's been forced to work for him. Word is, he knew Henry Pike personally. The Copper Dollar Saloon was exactly what Dasan expected, a smoke-filled den of gambling and drinking. Jules Martel held court at a corner table dealing cards to miners who looked like they should have been spending their wages on food rather than poker. Jules was a man in his 30s, well-dressed despite the rough surroundings, with quick eyes and careful movements. When Nora approached his table with Violet in tow, disguised as her visiting niece, he recognized the child immediately. "Well, well," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the saloon's din. "Seems like everyone in the territory's been looking for little Miss Pike here. $1,000 bounty makes a man pay attention. We need to talk," Nora said quietly. "Privately." Jules excused himself from the game and led them to a storage room behind the bar. Once the door closed, his carefully maintained composure cracked. "Do you people have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "Bringing her here, Crowder's posted a bounty on her head, and half the men in this saloon would sell their mothers for that much gold." But even as he spoke, something in his expression suggested an internal struggle. Jules moved to the window, staring out at the street while his fingers drummed nervously against a whiskey barrel. "Why haven't you collected it?" Nora challenged. Jules was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried genuine regret. "Because I knew her father. Henry Pike was one of the few decent men in this cesspit of a town." He turned back to face them, his internal battle visible in his expression. 3 years ago, I got in over my head with gambling debts, dangerous debts to violent men. I was facing a beating that might have killed me, maybe worse. The debt was to Crowder's men, actually. They were going to make an example of me." Jules paused, clearly wrestling with shame. "I was actually considering taking their offer work for them rig games to cheat miners out of their pay, and they'd forgive my debt. Easy money, they said. All I had to do was forget I had a conscience." He looked at Violet, seeing Henry's stubborn chin and Ruth's gentle eyes. "I was in the Silver Dollar, actually shaking hands with Crowder's man to seal the deal when Henry Pike walked in. He took one look at the situation and stepped between us. Told the man he'd vouch for my debt personally if they'd give me time to earn it honestly." "Why would he do that?" Violet asked. Jules smiled ruefully. "I asked him the same thing later. He said he'd been watching me play cards, and he could tell I was cheating myself, not the other players. Said anyone who'd rather lose his own money than cheat working men had something worth saving." Jules's voice grew thick with emotion. "He not only vouched for my debt, he helped me find legitimate work hauling supplies to honest miners. Never asked for anything except that I try to be the man he thought I could be." "But you went back to working for Crowder anyway," Nora observed. Jules's face crumpled with shame. 6 months later, they came for me again. Said Henry Pike couldn't protect me forever, and they'd make sure something permanent happened to him if I didn't cooperate. So I gave in. Started running crooked games again, skimming money from miners who couldn't afford to lose." He looked directly at Violet. "Your father found out, of course. Could have exposed me, ruined me completely. Instead, he pulled me aside and said, 'Every man gets to choose his path, Jules. Question is whether you'll choose the hard right or the easy wrong. But choose fast, because running with wolves makes you one of them.'" Jules moved away from the window, his decision finally made. "I chose wrong then, but maybe I can choose right now. What do you need?" From there, they planned quickly. Jules would create a distraction at the jail, using his connections and knowledge of the guards' routines, while Dawson and Nora attempted a rescue through the building's rear entrance. But as they prepared to leave the storage room, the saloon suddenly went quiet, with the kind of silence that precedes violence. Through the thin walls, they could hear heavy boots crossing the wooden floor, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of spurs. "Jules Martel," a voice boomed across the saloon. "I need to have a word with you about some of your recent customers." Jules's face went pale. Someone had seen them together, had recognized Violet despite their disguise. "Back window," he whispered urgently. "I'll stall them." But before they could move, the storage room door burst open with splintering force. Deputy Stern stood framed in the doorway, his hand resting on his gun butt with casual menace. He was a tall man with cold gray eyes and a scar on his jaw exactly as Nora had described. Well, well, he said with mock surprise. Looks like Christmas came early this year. Behind him crowded several rough-looking men in canvas dusters, all armed and ready for violence. But it was Stern himself who commanded the room, his presence filling the small space with barely controlled menace. "Deputy Stern," Nora said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't realize visiting a saloon was against territorial law." "It isn't," Stern agreed with false pleasantness. "But harboring fugitives is a hanging offense, as is conspiracy to interfere with legitimate company business." His cold gaze fixed on Violet. "Hello there, little miss. Lot of important people been looking for you." The phrase struck Nora like a physical blow, confirming her worst suspicions. But it was Violet who surprised them all by speaking up with startling clarity. "You talk just like someone my mama used to know," she said, her young voice cutting through the tension. She had a brother who always said, "That's the way of it," when he didn't want to argue. Said it was a bad habit he picked up from their daddy back in Kansas. For just an instant, Stern's professional mask slipped completely, revealing something that might have been pain or regret before his face hardened again. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "Smart little girl. Too smart for her own good, and that's the way of it." The confirmation hung in the air like a death sentence. Deputy Stern was indeed Caleb Ruth Pike's lost brother, the family member whose betrayal would wound her more deeply than any physical torture. Jules stepped forward, desperation making him brave. "Now hold on, Deputy. I think there's been some misunderstanding here. This lady and her niece just wanted information about local customs. Nothing illegal about friendly conversation." Stern's laugh was like ice cracking. "You know what I think, Jules? I think you've been playing the wrong kind of games, the kind that get people hurt permanent like." But even as he spoke, Stern made the crucial mistake of glancing away from Dasan for just a moment, his attention divided between Jules's nervous fidgeting and his own emotional turmoil at being recognized by his sister's child. It was the opening Dasan had been waiting for. Moving with explosive speed despite his injury, he drove his shoulder into the nearest enforcer, sending the man crashing into the whiskey barrels. He grabbed the stunned man's rifle and swung it like a war club, catching another enforcer across the face. The storage room erupted into chaos. Nora grabbed Violet and pushed her toward the back window while Jules dove for cover. Stern drew his pistol, but Dasan was already moving with fluid grace, using the room's cramped confines to his advantage. A gunshot thundered in the enclosed space, deafeningly loud. Dasan felt something tug at his shirt sleeve, but kept moving, his battle instincts taking control. He crashed through the back window in an explosion of glass, landing hard in the alley, but rolling to absorb the impact. Violet was already there, helped through by Nora, who followed immediately after. Jules came last, squeezing through the narrow opening with difficulty. "The horses!" Nora gasped, pointing to where she had left their mounts. "We have to reach them before—" More gunshots from inside the saloon cut her off, followed by Stern's voice bellowing orders. "They're getting away. Seal off every road. No one leaves without my permission." They reached the horses, just as the saloon's front door burst open, spilling armed men into the street. Dasan boosted Violet onto the saddle in front of him, ignoring the blood from glass cuts on his hands. His wounded leg screamed as he swung up behind her, but there was no time for pain. The chase through Lantern's End's twisting streets became a nightmare of bullets and shouting. Stern had turned out half the town, and every corner brought fresh danger. Jules, riding beside them, suddenly cried out and swayed in his saddle. "I'm hit." He gasped, blood spreading across his shirt. "Left shoulder. I can still ride, but not for long." They broke free of the town's outskirts as the sun was setting, painting the sky blood red. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew fainter, but didn't disappear entirely. As they rode through the gathering darkness, Violet clutched her father's sack and tried not to think about her mother alone in a jail cell waiting for a transfer that would mean death at the hands of her own brother. Night settled over the high desert like a burial shroud. They had ridden hard for hours following game trails that Dasan hoped would confuse their pursuers. Jules was growing steadily weaker, blood loss taking its toll, but he gritted his teeth and stayed mounted. They stopped at an abandoned prospector's shack, where Nora tended to Jules's wound while Dasan stood watch. Violet sat in the corner, examining her father's papers by candlelight. "There's something else here," she said suddenly, finding another hidden pocket in the sack. From it, she withdrew several more pages of notes, a red-striped kerchief that belonged to her mother, and most importantly, a small photograph wrapped in oiled cloth. The image showed a young man in army uniform standing beside a woman who was clearly Ruth Pike, 20 years younger. The soldier's face bore the same scar on the jaw that marked Deputy Stern. "That's Mama," Violet said, pointing to the woman. "But I don't know who the soldier is." Nora took the photograph and studied it carefully, her face growing pale. "That uniform is from the Kansas regiments. And look at the soldier's face, that scar on his jaw." The photograph was absolute proof that Deputy Stern was indeed Caleb Ruth's brother. But it also revealed something else. This was evidence that could destroy him, completely proof of his true identity, that went beyond mere resemblance or shared mannerisms. Even as they absorbed this revelation, sounds outside made them freeze. Through the shack's window, Dasan could see riders approaching, at least 6 of them, moving in a search pattern. "They found us again," he whispered. Jules struggled to his feet despite his wound. "There's an abandoned mine shaft northeast of here," he said. "The main tunnel's still sound. We could hide there until they pass. Or be trapped like rats," Nora pointed out. "Better than a gunfight we can't win," Jules replied. They slipped out the back just as voices erupted from the front, their pursuers having discovered the shelter. The mine entrance yawned before them, carved into the hillside with weathered timber supports. They slipped inside just as torchlight began to flicker in the distance. Inside, the mine darkness was absolute. They felt their way forward slowly, hands trailing along rough walls. The air was stale and heavy with old explosives and rotting timber that creaked ominously. "This tunnel connects to the main Black Mesa complex," Jules whispered as they moved deeper underground. "If we can reach the central processing area, there are multiple exit points. But it's dangerous these workings aren't maintained." They had gone perhaps 200 yards when Violet suddenly stopped. "Listen," she whispered. From ahead came the sound of voices, not their pursuers, but other people already in the underground passages, talking quietly in multiple languages. "Transfers happening tonight. D14's getting crowded. Crowder wants the area cleaned out before the inspector arrives." Dasan felt his blood run cold. They had stumbled into something much larger than a hiding place. This mine was connected to the entire Black Mesa complex, serving as a route to the underground prison where Crowder held his enemies. A desperate plan formed in his mind. Instead of hiding, they would go deeper directly into the heart of Crowder's empire, where Ruth Pike was being held. He explained his reasoning to the others. "Now that's suicide," Jules said immediately. "D14 is guarded around the clock. We're probably dead anyway," Nora pointed out grimly. "At least this way we might save some lives." Violet listened with the serious expression that had become her trademark. "Papa always said doing the right thing was sometimes more important than being safe," she said. "If Mama's down there, we have to try." From behind them came the sound of their pursuers entering the mine, eliminating any possibility of retreat. Moving as quietly as possible, they followed the main tunnel deeper into the mountain. The voices ahead grew clearer as they approached a junction where several passages converged into a larger chamber. When Dasan peered around the corner, what he saw made his warrior's heart burn with rage. More than 24 men sat chained to the tunnel walls in various stages of exhaustion and despair. Some were miners who had complained about conditions, others were settlers who had refused to sell their land. All bore marks of systematic brutality. And there in the darkest corner sat Ruth Pike. She was thinner than Dasan remembered her brown hair, matted her dress torn and dirty. But her eyes still held defiance, and when she saw Dasan's face appear in the tunnel entrance, those eyes widened with desperate hope. 3 guards sat at a makeshift table playing cards and sharing whiskey. They were relaxed, confident in their underground security. It was confidence that Dasan was about to shatter. He signaled for the others to wait, then began to creep forward with hunting cat silence. His injured leg protested every movement, but years of warfare had taught him to ignore pain when lives hung in the balance. But before he could reach the guards, loose rock dislodged by his passage clattered to the tunnel floor. The sound seemed loud as thunder in the underground silence. "And what was that?" one guard demanded, rising with his hand moving toward his rifle. "Probably just another rock fall," his companion replied, but he was reaching for his weapon too. The third guard was more cautious. "Check it out," he ordered. Could be those escapees from town. As the first guard approached with his rifle ready, Dasan realized stealth was no longer an option. Moving with explosive speed, he burst from concealment and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending him crashing into his companions. The chamber erupted into chaos as the guards scrambled for weapons, while Dasan fought with desperate fury. His injured leg nearly betrayed him when one guard grabbed it, but he used the man's grip against him, spinning and driving his elbow into the guard's temple. "Dasan." Ruth Pike's voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. "How did you... Where's Violet?" "Safe in here." Dasan replied breathlessly, working to unlock the chains with keys from the unconscious guards. "We came to bring you home." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, accompanied by harsh voices giving orders. "The transfer," Ruth said urgently. "They're moving all of us tonight to a deeper level. My brother, Deputy Stern, though I suppose you know his real name now, said it was to make room, but I heard him talking to Crowder. They're planning to seal the tunnels permanently with everyone inside." The implications were horrifying. Crowder wasn't just imprisoning his enemies, he was preparing mass murder that would eliminate every witness while providing perfect alibis. Jules, despite his wound, had been examining the tunnel junction. "There's that old ore cart system," he reported. "The tracks lead downhill toward the main processing facility. If we could get it moving." "It's dangerous," Nora protested. "Those tracks haven't been maintained in years." "Oh, what choice do we have?" Dasan asked grimly, helping the prisoners toward the cart. "Stay here and die slowly, or take our chances on the ride of our lives." Working desperately, they loaded the rescued prisoners into the ore cart. Jules took position at the brake lever, despite his wound. Violet clutched her father's sack, the evidence inside more crucial than ever. Dasan released the brake and gave the cart a hard push. Immediately, they began rolling down the steep incline, wheels squealing against rusty rails. The darkness rushed past them, broken only by occasional torches that flashed by in brief moments of illumination. Behind them, shouts of alarm echoed as their pursuers discovered the escape. But the cart was already gathering dangerous momentum, moving too fast for anyone on foot to follow. What followed was a terrifying journey through the bowels of the Black Mesa complex. The cart swayed and bucked on uneven tracks, threatening to derail at every curve. Water dripped from above, and the air grew thick with sulfur and decay. They passed through vast chambers supported by massive timber frameworks that groaned under the weight above. Past flooded shafts where equipment rusted in stagnant pools, past evidence of cave-ins that had been abandoned rather than cleared. Gunshots echoed behind them as Stern's men gave chase, but the cart was moving too fast for accurate shooting. The real danger came from the deteriorating tracks themselves, which grew increasingly unstable as they descended deeper. A section of rail weakened by years of water damage gave way just as they passed over it. The cart tilted sickeningly before somehow finding its balance and continuing its plunge. Jules, his face gray with concentration, fought to control their descent with the primitive brake system. Sweat streamed down his face despite the chill, and his wounded shoulder left blood on the brake lever. The main processing level. Ruth gasped, pointing ahead where torchlight revealed a vast chamber that dwarfed everything they had seen. That's where they process the ore. If we can reach it. But disaster struck with devastating inevitability. A massive support beam rotted through with age chose that moment to collapse. It crashed down directly in front of the cart, and Jules had no choice but to pull the brake with all his remaining strength. The cart slammed into the obstruction with tremendous force, throwing them in all directions. Jules was hurled clear, hitting the tunnel wall with sickening impact. Violet flew from the cart, but landed in Dassan's protective arms as he rolled to absorb the impact. Nora and Ruth crashed into mining equipment, emerging bruised but alive. They found themselves in the main processing chamber, a cathedral-sized space carved from living rock. Torches revealed the scope of Crowder's empire, massive conveyor systems, crushing equipment, and most ominously heavily armed guards already responding to their arrival. "There they are," one guard shouted. The escaped prisoners stopped them. Rifle fire erupted across the chamber with deafening intensity. Dassan grabbed Violet and dove for cover behind an overturned ore car, while the others scattered to whatever shelter they could find. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in an underground fortress. But then Dassan heard something that made his warrior's heart sing, voices echoing through the tunnels, speaking in the familiar language of his people. Hania had found them at last, following the trail signs Dassan had left during their journey. His young cousin emerged from a side tunnel leading a group of Mescalero warriors who had been tracking Dassan's deliberately placed markers for days. They had followed the path of bent branches and arranged stones, growing increasingly concerned for his safety. But the Apache warriors didn't simply charge into battle. Instead, they created chaos and confusion with their sudden appearance, drawing the guards' attention and fire, while creating opportunities for Dassan's group to move and fight back. The battle was fierce, but brief. Caught between multiple groups of fighters, the guards quickly realized continued resistance would prove fatal. But their victory was short-lived. Even as the last guard surrendered, a new sound echoed through the chamber, the rumble of explosives being detonated somewhere above. Crowder. Ruth gasped. He's collapsing the entire mine system, burying all the evidence along with everyone who could testify. The chambers shook as more explosions went off in sequence, bringing down tons of rock and timber. Dust filled the air, and torch flames flickered dangerously. There has to be another way out, Jules said desperately, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. Emergency shafts, drainage tunnels, something that connects to the surface. There is, Ruth said suddenly. I heard the guards talking. There's an emergency shaft that leads to a canyon about 3 miles from the main complex. But it's narrow and steep, and with the mine collapsing, it's our only chance, Hania said grimly. They fought their way across the collapsing chamber, dodging falling debris and breathing air thick with dust. The emergency shaft was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, angled steeply upward toward hoped-for salvation. One by one, they entered the claustrophobic passage. Violet went first, her small size an advantage. Then Ruth, driven by maternal desperation. Nora and the freed prisoners followed, while Dassan and Hania brought up the rear. The climb was nightmarish. The shaft was partially flooded with ice-cold water that soaked their clothes and numbed their hands. The walls were slick with algae, making every handhold treacherous. Behind them, the sounds of collapse grew louder. Jules, weakened by blood loss, nearly fell twice before Hania boosted him from behind. Only his determination and guilt over his complicity in Crowder's crimes kept him moving. They had climbed for what felt like eternity, when Violet's voice echoed down like an angel's call. I can see stars. There's an opening. The shaft emerged into a hidden canyon, miles from the main complex, bringing them into pre-dawn darkness, where they could breathe clean air. Behind them, the mountain continued to shake with systematic explosions. As the sun rose, painting the sky in brilliant gold and pink, they could see smoke rising from multiple points around the mining operation. Crowder was being thorough in his destruction, but he had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed all witnesses were dead. "What happens now?" Nora asked, looking at their group of exhausted survivors. Dasan studied the distant smoke with grim determination. "Now we make certain Harrison Crowder pays for everything he has done." The journey to Santa Fe took 4 difficult days, moving carefully to avoid Crowder's remaining trackers while dealing with Jules's worsening condition and the needs of other rescued prisoners. During their journey, Ruth provided crucial details about her brother's transformation from family member to killer. "Caleb was always weak," she said with bitter understanding. "Always took the easy path. When our parents got sick and needed expensive medicine, he was supposed to handle the family finances. Instead, he stole the money and ran west. Our parents died because they couldn't afford treatment." Her voice hardened with pain. "I always wondered what happened to my brother. Now I know he became exactly the kind of man who would murder his own brother-in-law and threaten his sister's child for money." They reached Santa Fe just as the territorial governor was preparing for an official tour of the mining district's. Perfect timing. Through Jules's remaining connections, despite his injuries, they arranged a meeting with Governor Samuel Axtell. The evidence they presented was overwhelming. Henry Pike's meticulous documentation, Ruth's testimony about her brother's identity, the physical proof of the D14 prison system, and the photograph of young Caleb in uniform all combined to create an undeniable case. The photograph was particularly damning, providing absolute proof of the family connection that explained the personal motivation behind the crimes. Governor Axtell, whatever his faults, couldn't ignore such evidence from credible witnesses who had suffered greatly to bring the truth to light. Within hours, he dispatched territorial militia to the Black Mesa complex, with orders to arrest Harrison Crowder and his associates. But when the soldiers arrived, they found only smoldering ruins and empty buildings. Crowder had fled during the night with his closest associates, taking only portable wealth while leaving behind a collapsing empire. Deputy Caleb Stern was found dead in his office, an apparent suicide, according to the official report. Though Ruth suspected her brother had been silenced by Crowder to prevent future testimony, the investigation that followed revealed corruption's full scope with shocking clarity. Dozens of officials were arrested on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy to commit murder. Mining claims were invalidated, illegal seizures reversed, and the underground prison system thoroughly documented. The territorial press called it the biggest scandal in New Mexico's history, while Eastern newspapers picked up the story as an example of frontier lawlessness and unchecked corporate power. For Violet Pike, vindication was bittersweet. Her father was officially cleared, his murder acknowledged, his reputation restored. Financial compensation provided enough for a fresh start, but no amount of money could bring Henry back or heal the trauma completely. As autumn settled over the territory, Dasan prepared to return to his people. His debt to Henry Pike had been paid, his sister's death avenged, and justice finally served. But saying goodbye to Violet proved difficult. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked as they stood beside the wagon that would take her and her mother to Colorado. "Perhaps," Dasan said, kneeling to her level with a slight smile. "But you will be strong with or without me. Your father's courage lives in your heart now." He handed her a small carved mountain lion, an Apache tradition for children who had proven their courage. "This will remind you that you survived when others would have given up. That is not a small thing." Ruth shook his hand with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you. You risked everything for strangers." "Not strangers," Dasan corrected gently. "Family chooses family, whether by blood or honor. Your husband understood this truth. Jules, recovered enough to travel, had decided his gambling days were over. His brush with death had given him new perspective on what truly mattered. though Dasan suspected the man would find other ways to test his luck. Nora had received compensation for her son's death and planned to start fresh, far from the mining camps. She hugged Violet fiercely before they parted. "Remember that sometimes ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to," she told the girl. "Your father proved that, and so did you." As the wagon disappeared down the dusty road toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Dawson felt familiar weight settle on his shoulders, not the burden of unpaid debts, but the satisfaction of honor preserved and justice served. His old wound would always remind him of past battles, but also of the courage he had found in a frightened child, and the strength that comes from standing with others against injustice. The mountains called to him with their promise of clean air and ancient wisdom. He answered that call with a lighter heart than he had carried in years, knowing that behind him the wreckage of Crowder's empire would remind future generations that no man, however powerful, was above the law when brave people demanded justice. In her father's sack, Violet carried tangible proof of what they had accomplished through courage and sacrifice. But more importantly, she carried unshakable knowledge that when darkness threatens the innocent, there are still people willing to stand in its path and say no more with absolute conviction. Absolute. The debt had been paid completely, and the mountain itself bore witness that justice, however delayed, would eventually find those who deserved it most.